some number of milli or even nanoseconds involved in at least calling the simplest of functions. And what am I proposing? Hey, you used to have all your HTML in one big file that's super simple to serve. Why don't you first call two functions, combine the three, a la string concatenation, and then send that to the browser? So I have introduced a bit of overhead here. Now, my pushback to that pushback is, don't worry about that for now. Frankly, caching will solve a lot of our problems, as we'll talk about later in the term. And by caching, I just mean, all right, sure, you have to do this. But the first time you do it, just save the results in a raw HTML file or in a database called memcache, which is running purely in RAM. Facebook uses this quite a bit to improve performance. So we can ameliorate those concerns as well. But that's one pushback. So let's see if we can do better. Well, let me go into version 2 of this. And in this version, what have I done that's a little differently? Well, rather than just require a file, and henceforth, let me call header.php and footer.php templates. They're just sort of boilerplate code that I want to use almost everywhere. So I've obviously changed the call from require to render header. Now, render header is not a PHP thing. I just invented it. And in fact, it's defined probably in a file called helpers.php. So I'm still requiring, but that's because I want access to some global functionality, functions I've written, like the lookup function from pset 7. So require once helpers has defined in it two functions called render header and render footer. So this is an improvement, I would argue. Why? Yeah. Yeah, so now I can apparently dynamically insert a different title. Why? Well, recall that PHP supports associative arrays, aka hashes. And so this hash allows me to pass in a key of title and a value of CS164 for this page. The footer is just some silly copyright notice or body tag and HTML tag closing. So I don't really need any arguments there. But this is a little nicer. So let's look at helpers.php. So helpers.php is actually pretty simple. So render header takes an argument. Know that if you don't know already, PHP can have default values. So if I don't want a title, I can just pass nothing, and the interpreter is not going to complain at me. Does anyone know what the extract function does? Yeah.
Takes all variables from an array and just brings them to a global namespace.
Yeah, exactly. Or to the local function namespace. Yeah, exactly. Extract takes an associative array that's got a whole bunch of key values. X equals Y, Z equals W. And what it does is it extracts into the stack frame in question variables X and Z and assigns them values Y and W so that now you can just say $X, $Z as usual. So why do I care about that? Well, the next line of code here is to require header.php, which is almost identical to before, but notice what I've done up top. I've generalized the title as coming from a variable called title. Now, I'll pick on my own code. I don't really have any error checking just yet, right? If you don't pass me a title, this is going to give me an undefined reference to it's going to trigger a notice because that variable might not exist. So we can do better. But at least I had the foresight to remember this oddly named function to escape my inputs just so that a user doesn't intentionally or accidentally inject some JavaScript code or the like, which can typically violate someone's privacy. All right, so that's a little better. Let's see if we can't do even better than that. So in version 3, that was kind of a waste of code that I just wrote. Render header, render footer. Why don't we generalize the idea of templates themselves? Let me define a function called render that takes two arguments, potentially. The first of which is the name of the template that I want to render. The second of which is an array of key value pairs that I want to insert into that template. So now I can use the same function at top and bottom. And if I look now in helpers.php, I have just one function here. I also have this. So anyone recognize this kind of syntax up top? It's obviously a comment, but I seem to be using the same style. Yeah, so this is something we'll preach and ultimately require for your own code. So there's different tools that do this. And if you wrote Java code in high school or even here, you might be familiar with JavaDoc, which is pretty much identical to this. That kind of became the de facto standard. And JavaDoc, or in this case PHPDoc, is a set of conventions that you adhere to in such a way that when you run a command, PHPDoc, on your code, or in the world of Java, JavaDoc on your code, it will read through all of your .php files, look for all of the comments that are structured exactly like that, and then generate for you a special web page or suite of web pages that document all of your functions' names and return values and arguments and comments and all of that so that you yourself don't have to. You just comment your code along the way. You use these little tags like @param to say this function takes a parameter, its type is array, it's called data, and then I can even put some words there if it's not wholly obvious, key value pairs, and that will automatically get inserted into my documentation. And certainly working with other people or producing code that you want to allow the rest of the world to use, a la open source, my God, this is what you can provide your partner with. You can start, and I do this myself when starting projects, you start by writing your PHP files and just writing the functions' names and signatures, so what arguments they take, and then you just do open curly brace, close curly brace, and inside you write / to do, right? And you come back to this later, but you document it above. Then you run a command like phpdoc, and voila, you show your partner, here's what I'll implement for you. It might take you 2 weeks, but at least you've agreed on these conventions early on. So getting into this habit is now useful not just for you, but also potentially for others. All right, so that's a little cleaner now, and I'm doing a little error checking. If the file exists, go ahead and require it. Otherwise, don't do anything. But let's take things up a notch further. Let me go into index.php in version 4. And what have I done here? So there's only one material difference in this file. It might be hard to spot, but does anyone notice what I did differently? Yeah, includes. So we kind of used this convention in CS50's pset 7 if you took that, if you did that pset. But we didn't really preach this philosophy. But it's definitely important when it comes time to actually writing software that real users are going to use. And by that I mean this. Let me go ahead and do ls in this directory. And notice that I've cleaned things up a little bit, just like pset 7. Rather than put all of my PHP files in the same folder, I kind of want to isolate them so that the related files are all clustered together in a folder. And by related, I mean things like the templates. Like header.php, footer.php is never supposed to be visited directly by a user. So why is it in the equivalent of my public HTML directory, right? The user shouldn't even need to know that exists. And frankly, I don't even want him or her to just guess by typing in random URLs that there might be other files there. So I might want to put it in a directory and then somehow set permissions on that directory so that the rest of the world can't even access it. So this example here, 4, is a step toward that, where in templates, I've put precisely those files, header and footer.php, and includes, even though there's not much there, I've put helpers.php. So it's a step toward better organization. But find fault still. What's still problematic about this directory structure? Yeah?
Every time you want to make a new lecture or add one, you have to copy lecture 1 still or lecture 0.
All right, good. So we still haven't solved that original problem, which is there's going to be some copy and paste next week when I make lecture 2.php and lecture 3. So we can fix that. And then 2, just this idea of security, right, really includes and templates. They don't need to be web accessible. The contents of those files do need to be, but their file names don't need to ever appear in URLs. So ideally, where would I want to put includes and templates in terms of my folder structure? Above, right? MV something ... Like get it out of there, right? And this is a principle that's all too commonly ignored, especially with various open source projects and even CodeIgniter, which we'll introduce in just a bit. These open source tools, MediaWiki and the like, which are meant to be easy for users to use, and they typically say, OK, download this zip file, unzip it, put it in your public HTML directory, and you're on your way. The problem then is that all of the logic of the program is publicly accessible, and things like config.php, which we had in 50 for pset 7, I mean, God forbid you screw up the web server's web configuration, even for just a few minutes. Maybe your PHP files will just be completely publicly accessible. In fact, we can simulate this. So I have a web server here on the computer. Normally, this is example 4. If I go into example 4 and click on index.php, which is what I'm seeing now, suppose I'm bad at system administration and I screw up, or I'm on a shared web host and someone else screws up. Let me become root for a moment. So for those unfamiliar, sudo su makes me become root. I don't need a password in this version of the appliance. If I go into etc httpd conf.d, and we'll talk about these things in passing over time. These are conventions in Linux systems as to where things are stored. Notice that there's some PHP stuff in here. Let me accidentally open up mod suphp, and let me do this. Let me turn off PHP, which effectively is what that thing does. And now if I type service httpd restart. This means restart the web server software. And now I go back to my browser and reload. I didn't disable it enough. One sec. php.conf. Oh, it's in there too. That's why. OK. Let's restart the server once more. All right. This happens. Now, granted, you have to be a real idiot to jump through that many hoops to actually expose your code in this way. But most of the time, you're using shared web hosting sites if you're not owning or leasing your own servers. So all it takes is for one simple misconfiguration or someone makes a typo in the web